Hello and welcome to another episode from Restoration DIY. I'll be taking a break from my usual epoxy resin projects, so this time I'll be trying something different. I'll be turning a bowl from walnut with a Milliput decorative inlay. So let's get into it. This is a piece of walnut which I was told had been air dried in a barn for at least 3 years, so I was confident it would be dry enough to work with. The first job was to mark a centre point and drill a hole for the locating pin on my circle cutting jig, after which I used the bandsaw to cut the timber blank roughly to round. Using the centre cutting jig on the bandsaw, I cut away the larger chunks, working my way around the piece of walnut, gradually cutting smaller pieces away until it's more or less to round. After that, using the same hole I drilled earlier, I can fix the blank to the lathe using a woodworm screw, which is firmly held in the chuck. I also use the tailstock to hold it securely in place and give extra support. The blank was very unbalanced, so with the lathe at around 300 RPM, I use the 1/2 inch bowl gouge to remove material, slowly getting it to round. I don't get to use this gouge very often as it's a bit unwieldy on the smaller resin projects, and it also has a different grind to the 3/8 bowl gouge I normally use, so it took a bit to get used to. Once I'd got my eye in, I was able to use the gouge more effectively, taking much better cuts, switching to shear scraping when it got away from me to level the surface. Having got the blank to round, I could move on to forming the base. Taking the 1/2 inch bowl gouge, I began removing the waste material, working away from and towards the base to see which worked best to reduce the tear out. In the end, neither direction seemed to make a difference, so I just concentrated on getting the base roughly to shape. At this point, I was set on forming a tenon for when I turned the bowl around. Doing this also helped to reduce the height of the bowl, which at this stage was looking a bit out of proportion to the bowl diameter. For note, I've turned the lathe speed up to around 475 RPM. I kept on removing material using a combination of shear scraping and push cuts. The tear out was beginning to concern me a bit, so I tried taking some lighter cuts, which helped a lot. The tenon needed a bit more work, so I cut away material so the chuck jaws would be able to get a good grip. After that, I spent some time reshaping the base into the side. This is where I decided to make a bit of a design change and incorporate a slightly overhanging rim. Not quite as defined as a pudding bowl rim, but enough to add a bit of detail. Using the bowl gouge, I tried to cut a line to form the undercut, but this didn't work out so well, so I came at it from a different direction, cutting from lower down up towards the rim, which worked much better. Shear scraping was doing a reasonable job at shaping the surface, but I decided to try the skew chisel, and as I started to use it, all seemed well. The shavings of walnut came away, and I thought it was doing a good job. That is, until I stopped the lathe to check my progress, and the tear out was not great, so I went back to shear scraping, only using the skew to define the rim overhang. With the outside more or less done, I moved on to the Milliput inlay. For this, I needed to cut a recess just below the rim. I cut 2 lines with a skew to define the edges, then I used the 1/4" parting tool to remove material down to a depth of around 3mm. At this point I had to ignore the tear out, so after a quick check and a final pass with the parting tool, it was ready for the Milliput. These are the colours I had to choose from, and I decided to go with turquoise blue and superfine white. For those that don't know, Milliput is a 2-part epoxy putty. It's mixed together in equal parts by hand. The boxes I have here are about a year old, and I was hoping they would still be okay. I'm not going to dwell on this part too long, but you take equal parts and basically mush them together. As it heats up in your hands, it becomes more malleable. With the coloured version, it's easy to tell when they're thoroughly mixed. The white coloured one, well, that's a bit more tricky, but as a rule of thumb, when you think it's done, mash it together for a few more minutes just to make sure. After mixing, I tore off equal pieces of each colour, rolled them out to identical lengths, then I twisted them together, hoping that this would form a randomish pattern. Then it was just a simple case of putting it in the recess and applying plenty of pressure to make it stick. I did this until the recess was full, making sure not to leave any voids or any low spots. Once again, I'm not going to dwell on this bit, so with the recess nice and full, I left it overnight to cure. It's the next day and the Milliput appears to have cured. I used a skew chisel to gently remove the excess. This took a few goes. The last thing I wanted to do was take too much off and have to redo it. I left it slightly proud of the surface before moving on to the next bit. I decided to add a border. For this I used a thin parting tool to cut a recess at each side of the inlay. I cut in to a depth of around 3mm, an eighth of an inch, making sure to get as crisp a line as I could. With that done, I mixed some more white Milliput and rolled it out into thin strips and pressed it into the recess, using the thin parting tool to make sure it was nice and compact. The Milliput went into the recess quite easily, but in hindsight, if the gap was a little wider, it would have been less fiddly. Another thing to watch out for is the finished surface of the wood should be sanded to a fine finish, as the Milliput will get into all the cracks and voids, and it's a pain to clean up. It's the next day and it's time to finish the inlay. I used a skew chisel to gently remove the excess. This was straightforward, and when I got close to the level of the bowl, I sanded with 80 grit to finish it off. After sanding the inlay, I then had to deal with a tear out. To do this, I broke out my 3/8 bowl gouge. This had just been sharpened, and using this to cut away thin layers, I was able to get rid of most of it. To get rid of what was left, I power sanded it with 80 grit until it was gone, Then I filled the cracks in the surface with black Starbond superglue. I could have used clear superglue and sawdust to fill the cracks, but I think it always looks like a crack filled with sawdust and superglue. That's why I use black Starbond. When it's finished, it's not trying to be something it isn't. Each void needs to be filled a few times and sprayed with accelerator. After a few moments, the glue cures and it can be power sanded level with the surface. And with the cracks all filled up, I sanded from 80 to 400 grit. As I mentioned earlier, I fully intended to use a tenon to hold the bowl in the chuck, but in the end I decided to get rid of it and cut a mortise, so off it came. I used a 3/8 bowl gouge to thin it down, then I cut the outer edge with the dovetail cutter. With that done, I removed what was left of the tenon and cleaned it up with a gouge, and then I sanded the base to match the rest of the bowl. Sanding done, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. Then I applied 2 coats of sanding sealer, both denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire grit, a single coat, cleaned away until no more is picking up on the paper towel. And to finish, wood wax 22, 2 coats polished off with paper towel to leave a deep lustre. With the bowl turned around and secured in the chuck using the tailstock for added support, I could begin hollowing out. The 3/8 bowl gouge was the tool of choice. I didn't bother facing off, I just got straight into removing material. As usual, I concentrated on cutting away the excess from the outer edge, working my way into the middle, keeping the centre support in place until a lot of the weight had been removed. When I was satisfied the ball wasn't out of balance, I removed the tailstock and cut away the centrepiece by gradually thinning it down until it broke off near the base. With that out of the way, I could continue cutting away with material, gradually thinning the bowl. I was aiming for a wall thickness of around 12mm. Most of this video is played at around 3.5 times normal speed. This is so I can show more of what I'm doing, but I thought it would be fun to show some slow motion action. In the slow-mo you can see how the gouge is offered up to the face of the bowl, and as I move the cutting edge further down to where it begins to pick up the cut. Cool, I think I'll include more slow-mo in my future videos. But anyway, moving on, I still had a lot of material to remove, so I set to with a bowl gouge cutting away at the walnut, stopping from time to time to check the wall thickness. Whilst you watch me hollowing out this bowl, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everyone who watches my videos. At the time of publishing this episode, I'm 50 subs away from the magical 1000, which I hope to get to in the next week. So if I could ask you to subscribe, it will really help me out. Smash that like button and leave a comment. I try to reply to everyone. I have many more projects coming up, and not all of them will be wood turning. Let's see if we can get to the 1000 subs before the next episode. As I got deeper into the bowl, it got more difficult to use the gouge, so I switched to a side cutting scraper. Before using it, I reground the cutting edge to a 10-degree bevel. I was a bit concerned it would make a mess of the surface, but I needn't have worried. I was able to take control cuts, and whilst the surface looked as though it had deep tear out, it was easily dealt with when I sanded. With the inside more or less done, I tidied up the rim, then I sanded with 80 grit. This revealed a couple of tool marks, so I made a few more light passes with a scraper, and then it was ready for sanding. I sanded from 80 to 400 grit, then I gave it a thorough clean down with denatured alcohol, before applying 2 coats of sanding sealer, denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Yorkshire grit was up next, just a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away with paper towel. Then wood wax 22, a heavy single coat applied to the surface, then polished off with more clean paper towel. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax, applied to the inside and outside, then polished off to seal and protect the surface. There we go, another project finished, and I'm quite pleased with it. To be honest, it's the first bowl of this size I've turned from a solid blank, and I've learned a lot. I hope you like it as well. Let me know in the comments what you think. It'll be good to get some feedback. So with that, if I could ask you to subscribe and click the bell to be notified when I release a new video, and a thumbs up will be great. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.